In Topic 7.8, we'll explore mass atrocities that happened after the year 1900. Feel free to pause the video and take a moment to review the CED content if you would like. The essential question we're answering in Topic 7.8 is what were the causes and consequences of 20th century atrocities? During the 20th century, the rise of extremist groups, as well as totalitarian and communist governments, led to the attempted destruction of specific populations. Genocide, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. During the 20th century, we have multiple examples of genocide and other types of ethnic violence. On the screen in front of you, you see a map from World War II that details the sites of major concentration camps and major extermination camps during the Holocaust. The Armenians are a Christian minority group that's lived on the Anatolian Peninsula since antiquity, since before the transition to the Common Era. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire invaded Russian territory. And during that invasion, they used that as a kind of pretext or an excuse to massacre Armenians as they traveled between the Anatolian Peninsula and their Russian targets. From that point onward, the Ottomans engaged in mass executions, as well as the forced deportation and conversion of Islam to many. They also forced many Armenians to go on death marches into the Syrian desert. It's estimated that between 1915 and 1916, up to 1.2 million people were killed, and more continued to be killed in the time that followed. The Turkish government officially denies the existence of the Armenian genocide to this very day. Hopefully you remember from World History 1 and earlier this year, the foundations of Russia, starting in the Kievan Rus in modern-day Kiev. Hopefully then you remember that the Mongol Empire's takeover and preference for Moscow led to the rise of Muscovy and the movement of the center of gravity in the Russian world from Kiev to Moscow. That starts a rivalry between these two groups that persists through this day. Starting in the 1880s, Russia tried to eliminate Ukrainian culture and language. In 1914, they prohibited the Ukrainians from having an independent free press. During the 1930s and 40s, many Ukrainian leaders were either forced to leave and were deported to Central Asia, and many were just outright executed. The Holodomor was the terror famine in Ukraine, and was a part of a larger Soviet famine that was going on at the time. So it wasn't just Ukraine that was caught up in this. But that happened between 1932 and 1933, and in that, around 3.5 million Ukrainians died. There's widespread belief that this was caused by Stalin and his government, although that's still not officially confirmed or admitted. Following that is the Great Purge. That was a Soviet campaign of really political oppression and repression of the wealthiest peasant groups, ethnic minorities, including but not limited to the Ukrainians, and other people they suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. On the screen in front of you, you see a statue that commemorates or commemorated the Holodomor. That statue was torn down in August of 2020, and most likely, one would presume, by Russian rebels. In the kind of context of the ongoing struggle between Russia and Ukraine, you hopefully have heard recent news about Crimea and other incursions by Russia into Ukrainian territory. So that makes sense in the context of that event to most likely be either Russian or pro-Russian forces within Ukraine to ascribe that to. But the statue very clearly commemorates the famine, as you can see by the famished figure. We talked briefly about some Japanese atrocities, starting with the massacre in Nanking. But that's just a part of a larger fear campaign that even started slightly before then, but continued on through World War II. During that time, we don't really know how many people really any one group killed, and estimates vary widely. But most numbers put the number of specifically Chinese people killed by Japan between 1937 and 45 to be somewhere between 10 and 14 million. It certainly wasn't only Chinese people they were killing, but it was by far the largest group. They also took prisoners of war in China and performed various medical and scientific experiments on them as well. As the war progressed, some parts of the Japanese military stopped taking prisoners of war entirely and instead chose to execute anyone that they captured. On the screen you can see some examples of some massacres that are ascribed to the Japanese during World War II. And you can see death estimates that range tremendously because, once again, the data is pretty hard to find and really hard to know. I do want to point out that this is just a small group of many, and there's massacres all the way down to small little groups of 10 people that were killed. But it went on, it was widespread, and Japan during the course of World War II killed millions. On the screen you also see two images. They're actually of the same person, Emperor Hirohito. He was emperor during World War II and was kind of seen as a supportive figure of the atrocities that were committed. On the right, you can see a photo of him from 1987. And later on in his life, he did express regret for some of the things that Japan had done. But I think it's interesting to also think about the relatively comfortable life he led, despite the many terrible things that were done under his leadership. So before we talk about the Holocaust, I want to talk about anti-Semitism briefly. Anti-Semitism is hatred or discrimination directed at any Semitic peoples. That could be anyone that's a speaker of Hebrew, speaker of Arabic, and there's a few other languages that are kind of considered in that family. In common usage, though, in a modern contemporary context, it usually means hatred or discrimination directed specifically at Jewish people. That's usually how it's used. There's a long tradition of anti-Semitism in Europe. It goes to well before the Middle Ages, but that's where I chose to start this list. But actually through the Church of Antiquity, there was growing anti-Semitism, and there was always the portrayal of Jewish people as being responsible for the death of Jesus as a pretext for hatred in Christian camps. That's true of the Passion plays that were common during the Middle Ages and fed into anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes and sentiment. We learned during the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula that after Spain and Portugal took over the peninsula, they forced all the Muslims to leave and that eventually forced all the Jewish people as well to either leave or convert. So that happened in 1492 in Spain and 1496 in Portugal. In 1555, there was a papal decree that forced Jewish people to move into specific neighborhoods that we've come to call ghettos. We've talked already about the pogroms in Russia. There was one set that began in 1881. Remember, those are essentially riots that intend to intimidate and persuade to leave Jewish people usually. I mean, it could be directed at any group, but in usual use, we're talking about directed at Jewish people. So there was an example in Russia in 1881, but also 1903. That spread into Eastern Europe in places like Ukraine and Belarus between 1918 and 1920. So those continued through Eastern Europe. And as we get into World War II, happened in Germany and Poland as well. So Hitler and the Nazis, as we talked about in topic 7.7, used the Jewish people as a scapegoat. They blamed them for some of Germany's post-World War I problems, blamed them as agents both of the capitalist West and the communist East, and so stirred hatred toward them as a sort of rallying cry, so to speak, around their fascist style of government. The persecution of Jewish people started right after Hitler took power. So he, remember, became chancellor in January of 1933. The Enabling Act of 1933 gave him essentially dictatorial powers. And then a month after that, in April of 1933, the Nazi Party began the persecution of Jewish people. As you see here at the top of the list, the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. So they essentially stopped trading with Jewish people. And I know that that's a far cry from where it would end, but as we're going to talk through the list, that's kind of the point. Is it starts as a small boycott of people and ends in absolute awful destruction and widespread death. So that death was between 1939 and 1945, Nazis and their allies killing over 6 million Jewish people. To put that in context, in 1933, the total Jewish population was about 9.5 million. So we're talking roughly just under 2/3 of the population. Granted, it was probably a little bit higher by 1939, but roughly in the ballpark of 2/3. While I'm on that subject, I actually want to go back and look at the maps on this slide real quick because I had meant to mention them. So if you look at the top, that's a map that shows the distribution of Jewish population in Europe in 1933. And you can see even after the pogroms, it was still centered in Eastern Europe and even into Russia as well. But you can also see that the kind of concentration was higher, right? The colors that we're looking at are darker and the numbers are higher. And if you put them in context of smaller populations at the time, because we're talking about 1933, it's much more considerable, the difference. The bottom map shows the same countries or the same part of the world in 2015. And as you can see, the numbers are quite smaller. And what I want you to think about is the entire trajectory of the Jewish people. Because in the 1940s, 2/3 of them were eliminated from the planet. And so their relative small number today is a direct product of the Holocaust and a direct product of this event, essentially. Hitler was almost successful, and it's part of the reason why they are, not just a protected minority group, but why they are such a minority group today is because their numbers were essentially lowered tremendously during this time. As you can see on the map, before this time, that they represented a much larger percentage of people, essentially, as we're talking about Europe, at least. So, talking through events of the Holocaust, like I said, in 1933, things really start with the boycott. In 1935, the Nuremberg race laws kind of brought in restrictions on people that were not considered Aryan, were not considered pure German, and that, of course, included Jewish people. There was banning of marriages, that kind of stuff, and other things as well. In 1937, there was an anti-Semitic exhibition in Munich that actually traveled around Germany. Almost 500,000 people went to it. Think of it as a big hate fair, essentially, and that spread the message of Aryan superiority, Jewish inferiority, and played on all these anti-Semitic terrible tropes that predated Germans, but were certainly extensively used by Germans. 1 year later, the Kristallnacht pogrom was a massive anti-Jewish riot through Germany that it's the Night of Broken Glass, and it was the start of kind of more outright violence. A year later, you had the confinement of Jewish people to ghettos. 2 years later, you had the movement of Jewish people into concentration camps. The concentration camps existed already. They started in the mid-1930s, actually. But before this time, they were labor camps. They were mostly Germans, actually, that were in them, Germans that were not loyal to the Nazi Party. But they were prison labor camps before this point. But they get converted into what would, in some instances, become death camps, of course. In 1942, so a year after that transition, Germany passed a new law that made it punishable by death to help Jewish people. And so that's what I meant about the progression of things. Just think about this. 9 years earlier, this started with a boycott of businesses. And 9 years later, you were killing people who were helping those people. Not even those people. You're already terrorizing them. Now you're killing anyone that helps them. And so it just shows the rapid acceleration into a terrible, dark chapter in human history and underscores why we need to remain vigilant through this day to any moves towards fascism, because the end of that road is a dangerous, awful one that we don't want to ever see again. In 1945, the liberation of camps was completed. It started in 1944. Following World War II, the Nuremberg trials put on trial leaders of the Nazi Party, and 12 of them were actually executed for war crimes. Among those war crimes, of course, included the acts of the Holocaust. On the right, you can see an image from Auschwitz at their liberation in 1945. The next atrocity to discuss is Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge were basically the Communist Party in Cambodia from 1951 to 1999. They didn't really have any meaningful power, though, until the 60s. In the 60s, starting in 1968, a civil war began between the Khmer Rouge and, at first, the Kingdom of Cambodia, and then the successor state to them, the Khmer Republic, which was a pro-U.S., pro-Western republic. So that civil war went on from 1968 to 1975 between the two governments that existed on the opposition side. And in 1975, the Khmer Rouge was successful in attaining power, and their leader, Pol Pot, took over. Between 1975 and 1979, he underwent a campaign to rapidly convert Cambodia into a communist, self-sufficient state. He did this with brutal repression of his people and the outright killing of many. You can see somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people died during his reign. That was about 25% of all Cambodians he killed. That ended in 1979, really, is when he lost power. But in 1978, the beginning of the end started when Vietnam invaded after Pol Pot attacked the border. He essentially thought that Vietnam was going to attack them, so he tried to be preemptive and committed a few atrocities along the border, massacred some towns. And as a result of that, Vietnam invaded in 1978 and toppled his regime. They stayed a power, they stayed a group in Cambodia all the way through 1999, engaging in some acts of violence, trying to be a part of the system at different times. Their existence kind of went in and out of even being communist, honestly. But in 1999, their leadership was disbanded or arrested entirely, and they ceased to exist from 1999. The last atrocity that's mentioned in the CED is in Rwanda. So Rwanda was part of the territory that was assigned to Germany coming out of the Berlin Conference. Remember, that's the scramble for Africa. After World War I, the colony was given to Belgium as a part of the League of Nations mandates, as a part of the punishment of Germany after World War I. Both Belgium and Germany favored the Tutsi minority, which was a group that represented about 15% of Rwanda at the time, as opposed to the Hutus, which were 84%, so they were the vast majority at the time. But they were in charge, and they were supported by both Germany and the Belgians. After World War II, Rwanda remained under Belgian control under what were the UN Trust territories, which were really just the successors to the League of Nations mandate systems. It was kind of the taking over of that system by the UN. 13 years later, in 1959, began the struggle for Rwandan independence, starting with the Rwandan Revolution, where a Hutu majority essentially tried to take power. They were successful really 2 years later, but were officially recognized by the international community in 1962, so 3 years later, and that's when they were granted independent status, recognized internationally, and were under the rule of their Hutu minority or majority from that point. But as you might imagine, that fed kind of resentment that ultimately leads to a civil war. That civil war starts in 1987 when the Tutsis form their own essential kind of political party in exile. They then try to invade Rwanda. They weren't successful at first. They were driven out. Like I said, 1990 is when that started, but they were not successful at all. But by 1994, they were more successful, more inroads into Rwanda and causing more problems. And as a result of that, there was a massacre then of Tutsis in Rwanda. And so between April and July of 1994, the Hutu majority killed between 500 and 800,000 Rwandans. You can see on the screen in front of you a picture that's actually from that genocide. Those are the bones and skulls of real Tutsis that were killed in this conflict. I know I've talked a lot about trying to make this content also relevant to you in a modern sense, so I thought you may get a kick out of seeing a picture from me, my senior year in high school. That was after 9/11, our school instituted a basically forced patriotism day, which my friends and I decided to kind of make a statement about. So we each highlighted a specific failing of American foreign policy that we disliked. And so mine was the Rwandan genocide and our failure to get involved and stop that from happening when we